You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
On failing in Gallipoli. The Anzac legend, or myth, has grown in the centenary since they stormed the beaches at Gallipoli. It has been heralded as the moment that birthed the Australian nation. The centenary commemorations of the First World War have continued the valorisation of campaigns such as the one in the Dardenelles. However, is there an honest enough reflection of the successes and failures of the campaign in the public discourse? G'day listeners, in this episode I'm going to look into the August campaign at Gallipoli, the climax before the withdrawal. My guest today is Dr. Rhys Crawley, a historian at the Australian War Memorial and an adjunct lecturer at University of New South Wales, Canberra. Before coming to the War Memorial, only a matter of weeks ago actually, Rhys was a research fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. G'day Rhys, thanks for hosting me here at the War Memorial and coming on the show for a chat.
Not a problem, Mick. I must admit podcasts are a really new thing for me. I only started listening to them a couple of weeks ago, but I really like what you're doing here on The Dead Prussian, and keep the episodes and the self-deprecating humour coming.
Well, I appreciate the compliment, Rhys, and if you can manage to fit one in every answer you've got for me, then I think we'll be off to a great start. Now, Rhys, you've recently taken up the post here at the War Memorial, as I mentioned before. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, about your work in reference to Gallipoli, but also your work that you're doing now here?
Yes, certainly. In 2007, after I'd finished an undergrad and an honours degree, I was lucky enough to be selected to come to the War Memorial as a summer scholar, and it was really my first chance to work as a historian. I then went to University of New South Wales at ADFA, now University of New South Wales, Canberra, to do a PhD. And towards the end of that, I moved over to the Australian National University to work on the official history of ASIO, the Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation, which I ended up co-writing a volume for. So really working in that intelligence history space. I then worked as a co-author on the official history of Australian peacekeeping, humanitarian and post-Cold War operations, which really continued up until a few weeks ago when I moved over here, where I'm now writing the official history of Australian operations in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2010. My first real passion, and I guess this goes back to my undergrad days and then continued through my PhD, which became the topic of my first book, Climax at Gallipoli, there's a plug for your listeners, was the Gallipoli campaign and in particular the August Offensive.
That was A Climax at Gallipoli by Dr. Rhys Crawley. There's the plug for the book. Don't worry, I'll still give the book a plug at the end and link it to our favourite bookstore. Now, for you and I, it's the end of July, but for the listeners who have just downloaded this as soon as it's released, because I know my listeners are loyal and prompt, it's actually the anniversary of the August Offensive. In fact, the anniversary of the August Offensive is something that occurs every August. That is a little known fact that is rarely advertised to the wider public. Can you give our listeners a quick summary about the August campaign?
I can, quick, okay. The August Offensive was the last and largest major Allied offensive at Gallipoli. It lasted from the 6th to the 10th of August of 1915, involved some 5.5 Allied divisions, and resulted in some 45,000 Allied casualties, 21,500 of those in 4 days. It was fought in all three sectors of the Gallipoli Peninsula, so at Cape Helles, where the British and French fought, at Anzac, where the Anzacs fought, and at Suvla Bay, where the British fought. If we remember that the campaign began in April, it quickly settled into a stalemate, and there was a belief within the Allies that they needed to do something to overcome this stalemate and to secure the perimeter of what was the Anzac sector. And so they started looking into the hills to the north, which really didn't have many enemy soldiers. The intelligence picture, even though it was incorrect, was painting the picture of an enemy with low morale. And this sort of led into those pre-war beliefs of the commanders that sweeping manoeuvre was much more desirable than stalemate. So all of that led to what became a 4-phased operation to push across the peninsula, control the peninsula and let the Royal Navy to get through the Dardanelles and sail up to Constantinople or modern-day Istanbul. So it all began on the afternoon of the 6th of August with a feint by the British at Cape Helles, and later that afternoon by a demonstration by the 1st Australian Infantry Brigade at Lone Pine.
So we'll stick with Lone Pine, not to ignore any of the British counterparts out there, but there's 2 Australian accents on this episode, so let's stick to the Aussies. So I won't make any jokes about Lone Pine, though I have heard it called Lonesome Pine before in another documentary by a colleague of mine. Lone Pine's synonymous in Australia with the discussion about the August campaign. It is one of these events that seems to receive a fair bit of valorisation, especially now that we're in the centenary stages. How was this 3-day battle significant?
As I said, it was a feint attack, and it was launched with the purpose of drawing Ottoman units towards it and therefore slowing their ability to recognise and react to what was the major Allied offensive to take place later that night against the Surrey Bear Ridge, which is the highest part of the Gallipoli Peninsula and about 1 kilometre north. The artillery fire in the lead up to this battle was pretty light and largely left the barbed wire intact. But crossing no man's land at 5:30 in the afternoon on a summer's day, the sun's there's no dark to hide the fact the attack's coming, was still nonetheless largely successful. But then what followed was really bloody fighting. It was hand-to-hand combat in the trenches, bombs, bayonets, hands, and 7 battalions were thrown into a small area, smaller than the size of a soccer field, resulted in more than 2,000 Allied casualties and 7 Victoria Crosses. But the Australians got into the Ottoman trenches and held those positions. And one of the interesting things about this failure is it's often described as a failure because it was too successful. That is, it drew the enemy units towards it too quickly and then allowed them to be redeployed further north against the main attack. But that overlooks the fact that in measuring it against its objective, it succeeded. It drew units towards it. And you can't really control what the enemy does after that. So really, Lone Pine is the only Australian success of the Gallipoli campaign. I think it's probably the best known of those battles in August. There are other battles such as the Neck, which we see in Peter Weir's film starring Mel Gibson on Gallipoli. But the more significant actions of the August offensive are those by the New Zealanders, the Indians and Monash's 4th Brigade against the Surrey Bear Ridge. Now, the New Zealanders perform exceptionally well. They take Chunuk Bair. They're later thrown off there on the morning of the 10th of August. The Indians briefly reach their objective but are soon shelled off by both enemy and their own fire. And Monash's 4th Brigade actually get lost in the terrain and don't know where they are and don't get to their objective. And at the same time that all of this is happening, a new corps of the British lands at Suvla Bay to try and establish that area as a base for operations thereafter. So I think if I was to sum it all up, really the whole thing tried for too much. They didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the tactics or the technology or really the capability to achieve their objective, and they're up against a very good enemy.
It's interesting the point you make about the Kiwis, and for the one Kiwi listener I know we definitely have, it's interesting to see that, very rarely do you hear, particularly in Australia, about, the good job that the NZ part of Anzac did, especially around Chunuk Bair, being able to take that objective and then losing it a little bit later after a hard fight. For those listeners that don't understand the aim at Lone Pine, what a feint is a commitment of enough resources to change the enemy's behaviour. It's a type of military deception, and it's different from a demonstration, whereas a demonstration you don't expect to have contact with the enemy. With a feint, you're committing blood and treasure in the form of the lives and efforts of some soldiers to change the behaviour of the enemy. And as Rhys has said, it's an important thing to recognise when a feint actually achieves its objectives, because whilst you can decide what you want the enemy to think, you may not ever understand what the enemy is actually going to do based on those thoughts. So Rhys, it seems to me we often overlook the failures of the Gallipoli campaign in favour of highlighting the courage and sacrifice of the Anzacs. That's not to say that the courage and sacrifice of the Anzacs is insignificant. However, as you stated, the British, the Indians were also there. There's a lot of people that were involved in this campaign. Why is it important to remember the failures of the campaign, the Dardanelles, and in particular the August campaign at Gallipoli?
I think it's probably important here for me to go back and just quickly explain why I did this study in the first place. And that is, in all the reading I was doing on Gallipoli, I kept seeing these claims that it nearly succeeded from all officers, generals right down. These terms, nearly succeeded, near success. And I had all these quotes on that. And it was clear to me that it had failed. They didn't achieve their objectives. The Ottomans won. But I was interested in testing the validity of some of those claims, that if things had been a little bit different, or if they'd had a little bit of luck, it would have changed the outcome of that battle. So I decided to go back and analyse Allied operational capabilities, and as part of that to really pull apart some of the strengths and weaknesses of a whole range of aspects. So looking at planning, at mobility, at fire support, at inter-service cooperation between Army and Navy, and logistics. And in doing this, I was able to see that the failure was the result of systematic failures and misunderstandings of the reality of the task required. So in doing so, studying the failures of Gallipoli and the August Offensive reinforced the importance of certain things, and things that today the military might see as lessons. Some of those that come out of my study that are really clear include the importance of setting realistic plans. So those that have a reasonable chance of succeeding with the resources available, and for drawing these up with reference to, rather than in ignorance of, things like fire support limitations. Another lesson was the need for an honest appreciation of the strategic and operational objectives, and to revisit that regularly. Now this doesn't happen at Gallipoli, or didn't happen at Gallipoli. The complexities of operating in a combined and joint context. I mean, this is a massive campaign, not unlike the sort of Allied campaigns we've fought for the rest of our military history. It shows the importance of having a firm appreciation of the complexities of both geography and terrain, and how both can affect and impede the outcome of military operations. And I think something that's been particularly ignored in the history of Gallipoli, and something that I spent a lot of time on, was the inherent difficulties of operating thousands of kilometres from home without a properly functioning logistics system. So, there's a need, and this is reinforced through the August Offensive, a need for bases with the requisite facilities and labour, for security on the lines of communications, for efficient and effective requests and acquisition programs, for local transport, and the importance of testing and altering administrative systems that don't function in practice. Now, none of this, even looking at it today, seems new. But these are all really, really interesting lessons that come out of Gallipoli. And so there's a whole range of factors in studying failed campaigns like this one that are equally applicable to today. And they just shouldn't be ignored. It doesn't take long studying this or studying contemporary campaigns to realise that many of the current challenges we face are not new. Indeed, they've been around for as long as people have been at war.
So lessons that our listeners can take away is that logistics has remained important throughout the history of warfare. The idea of a combined joint force is not necessarily something that was made up recently in the past few decades. It's not something that suddenly sprung to life in the Second World War. We can see that interaction between the land forces and the naval forces were key in a place such as Gallipoli. Now, Rhys, each guest is asked to finish a sentence on this show. Now, it's not because I am too lazy to look up the definition in the Macquarie Dictionary, which is the dictionary of my employer, and therefore I have to use it. No, I asked this question to continue our philosophical understanding about war. Big Carl sought to study war in a rationalist way, and this podcast is hoping to explore war in all its forms and avenues and aspects, so that we can continue to have an appreciation of the decisions and ramifications of this most violent of human behaviours. Now, you're no different to any other guest. Perhaps special, but definitely no different. So what I'm going to ask is, I'm going to ask you to finish the sentence, war is. Over to you.
Having listened to the show, I knew this was coming, but it doesn't really make it any easier to answer. Suffice to say, war is confusing, war is worth studying, and war is something I'm sure I'll understand less the more I delve into its complexities. But under all of that, and what underpins my writing, is that war is a human endeavour. Technology might make things easier, and it might remove people from certain situations, but at the end of the day, people are always involved, whether it's in making the decisions, in pulling the trigger, and in being killed. War is a tragic business, and that's why it's so important to study it.
Whilst a very articulate and eloquent answer, it does not fit in 140 characters, so the Twitter army may not be happy. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, I have a Twitter army. Do not annoy me or I'll send them towards you. No, it's a very interesting point you make, Rhys, and there's a lot of our guests that relate back to the human aspects of war. And I think in this day and age with technology and some of the different theories that went through during the Cold War and post the Cold War era about technology, revolutions in military affairs, effects-based operations, strategic bombing, people get lost in the technology aspects of war, but it will always be humans making decisions. Rhys, thank you very much for coming on the show, and by coming on the show, I mean letting me into the building here at the Australian War Memorial. They don't often do that, so it's always good to have an insider. For those listeners out there, please jump on your favourite online booking store. I actually have no advertising revenue for any of them, so I don't mind if it's Booktopia, Fishpond or Amazon. But you can find Rhys's book Climax at Gallipoli, The Failure of the August Offensive, right across the interweb. And I've been told by Rhys that he makes about $50 each time you buy this book. No, that's not true at all. Like all academics, I'm sure the book is not actually his retirement plan. Rhys, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick.
Okay, listeners, until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.